Hello, everyone. My name is Rakesh Khurana. I am the Danoff Dean at Harvard College, and I am just so thankful to have an opportunity to join you for this program. I want to just begin by thanking everybody who's helping sponsor this truly amazing alumni community effort. We have members of the Harvard College class of 1969, our Harvard alums for climate and the environment. It's a shared interest group in our HAA group, our Harvard Club of New Hampshire, our Harvard Office of Sustainability, and our Harvard Alumni Association. So really grateful to everyone to convene this really important conversation, and you'll get a chance to hear from these amazing panelists momentarily. I was asked to start and take a couple of minutes to talk about why the subject of climate change is so important to me. And I thought maybe I would share a story with you about my time at college. Going back in history, during my sophomore and junior years at Cornell, I lived at 934 Stewart Avenue in Ithaca, New York. And my apartment was about 15 or 20 minutes walk from campus. But my bedroom overlooked a waterfall. I've never lived in such a beautiful place since. But for me, the most amazing thing about this place where I was living was not the view, but that I happened to live next door to Cornell's most famous professor, the astronomer Carl Sagan. And Professor Sagan was the writer and narrator of a documentary series called Cosmos, which really introduced so many of us to the idea of how we can use science to understand our world. I think 500 million people ended up watching Cosmos. But he was also a public citizen who really cared deeply about nuclear proliferation, environmental degradation, and believed deeply that humans had to find a way to cooperate in order to ensure our survival. So remember, being that person looking out over that waterfall, worrying about whether I should take a class that I didn't want to take to help me get an internship in a company I don't even remember for a job I knew I wouldn't like. But meanwhile, this person who was living next door to me and who I had often had an opportunity to go hear and speak had such a different perspective. To Professor Sagan, the waterfall, Cornell, the journey I was on, all of it mattered, but it was all part of something much larger and also much smaller. In his wonderful book called The Pale Blue Dot, Carl Sagan wrote about the photograph of Earth that the Voyager took in 1990 from 4 billion miles away. You may have seen it. It's that famous swirling of the Earth that graces so many books and posters. And he wrote, "That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every revered teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam," end quote. Professor Sagan went on to say, and I quote again, "There's perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal with it more kindly, to be more kindly with one another, and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known," end quote. I think Professor Sagan recognized that the combination of our sort of, human intelligence as a species, but also our industrial society had led for the first time, he said, to a species that could literally change the Earth's climate. And it raised numerous questions for him. I think it raises numerous questions for all of us. Questions that he sort of would talk about as, could a species with that much power act responsibly? Would we? He was asking us to think, would we be willing to plant trees whose shade that we would enjoy but would be made for future generations? Could we expand our circle of concern to include species and life forms that were not us? I think Harvard, for me, has a really important role to play here. It's intrinsic to our mission. We confront difficult problems. That's what we do. We test hypotheses, we share information. And now we even see, in the midst of a global pandemic and our search for justice, a world turning to university scientists and expertise and health professionals to help guide the way forward. I think we have to continue doing that. Our mission of educating citizens and citizen leaders for our society has never been more important, especially through our transformative power of liberal arts and science education. So I believe that at Harvard, we have to recognize that this work is really critical. And not only is it not only work that I think our natural scientists who study our planet are doing, but actually it matters to every field of study, to philosophy, to government, to history, anthropology, math. Everything that we teach has something important to do in this important area. This work belongs to all of us, and I hope that Harvard continues to be a place where cross-disciplinary work can help shape new solutions and new ideas on this topic. I know, and I speak as the dean, but also as a father, as a person who cares about our planet, that if we don't take action, disastrous consequences lie ahead. And yet, I'm also very optimistic as an immigrant that our future can be better than our yesterdays. And I believe in the ability to change our future is within our power if we're willing to change how we live. So grateful again for this amazing panel. And I'm really pleased to turn over the floor now to our conversations moderator, Terrence McNally. Terry is from the Harvard College class of 1969. He is the host of the Disruptive podcast for Harvard's Weiss Institute. And we were just joking before we started that he's no stranger to the room that I'm currently in, the building I'm in, University Hall. I understand he was here as a participant in the Harvard strike of 1969. And I want to thank Terry and all this amazing panel that's been put together. Thank you for giving me a few minutes, and thank you for the work you're doing. It is because of you that we continue to think more broadly and move forward.
Thank you, Dean Khurana. And let me just make sure we've thanked all the producers and sponsors. Thank you to HAA, the Harvard Alumni Association, to the co-sponsors, members of the Harvard College class of 69, the Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment, the Harvard Club of New Hampshire, the Harvard Office for Sustainability, and additional support, Class Act HR 73, and Harvard Club of the North Shore. And to you folks who are joining online, if you're watching on Zoom, questions can be placed in the Q&A box, and the Q&A box you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Click on that, and then you'll be able to ask a question. And if you're watching on YouTube, you ask your questions in the chat box, and they will be shared with me. Dean Khurana referred to the protest of 1969, and I was cleaning through some stuff in the garage, actually this past weekend, and came across a special edition of the Harvard Alumni Bulletin. Here we get Harvard Alumni again. It was on the strike, and I found a photo of myself, arms locked with others, as we awaited the Massachusetts state troopers that were entering in the entrance behind me. And let me just mention that due to the pandemic, my hair is now the longest it's been since that photo was taken. By the way, in April 2019, on the 50th anniversary, some folks at Harvard held an event in which they remembered and reflected on the strike. And two of the organizers of that event were Miles Rappaport and Marshall Gans, both of the Kennedy School. Miles was moderator of session number 2, and Marshall is a member of this panel. So we keep the circle moving. Let me just make a few words of introduction. First, a bit of context. The first 3 sessions were dealt broadly with. The first dealt with the moment we face. Is it too late? What must be done? Session number 2 dealt with the responses and the roles of institutions, finance, government, business, academia. The third was on the need to move hearts and minds, the arts, spirits, religion. And this one focuses on mobilization, politics, and protest. The final one in January 13th, asks the critical question, will we get the job done? And let me also make a note regarding the term mobilization. I think of mobilization as all hands on deck. How do we bring all the necessary forces on board to confront what's an existential challenge? The US mobilized to confront the Depression, mobilized to fight World War II. We all know we should have mobilized in response to the pandemic. And we're talking today about what mobilization to confront the climate crisis might take and what it might look like. My first question to all 4 panelists will be to tell us a bit about your path to the work that you do today, especially in terms of climate. And I invite you to go back as far as you wish. Childhood inspirations, mentors, turning points, moments of decision, that sort of thing. So first, let me ask Kelsey Worth, class of 1991, a successful entrepreneur and founder of Mothers Out Front. Kelsey?
Thanks, Terrence. I'm not sure if, oh, here we go. Here's my video. Sorry, I tried to start it and it wouldn't let me. Well, thank you so much, Terrence, for that great introduction, and Dean Khurana for the lovely story about Carl Sagan, which was so inspiring. It's wonderful to be here with my fellow panelists and to be part of this great series of climate conversations. I really applaud the organizers for putting together a series of conversations on what is the greatest challenge facing global society. So Mothers Out Front, just very briefly, is a national grassroots movement of mothers from all backgrounds who are driving campaigns for bold climate action at the local, state, and national levels. Our vision is for a just and equitable world. And when we talk about justice, we think about justice in both intergenerational terms, meaning we cannot leave a planet for our children and our grandchildren that is inhospitable to human life. And of course, in terms of justice, for those communities, both here in this country and around the world, that are going to be impacted most by the climate crisis and are already being most impacted by our dependence on fossil fuels. So I came to climate change essentially because of the family I grew up in. My father was an elected member of Congress from Colorado for my entire childhood, and he and my mother both became very interested early on in climate change. And in fact, he co-sponsored some of the first congressional hearings on climate change about 30 years ago now. So it was very much in the air that I breathed growing up. We had climate scientists, including Carl Sagan, in fact, in and out of our kitchen and our living room. And yet, in spite of that early introduction to this enormous challenge, it wasn't something I spent a whole lot of time worrying about. My sense was that people like my father were supposed to solve it. Scientists were going to solve it, and I was not either, and neither a politician nor a scientist, and really had no role to play. So I felt it was safely in the hands of the experts. My perspective on that all changed when I became a mom, and suddenly everything about the climate crisis that we are in, I viewed through the lens of being a mother whose number one job is to protect my children. And it made me wonder how it is that 30 years on, we've made so very little progress in addressing this enormous crisis. Despite the science, despite the overwhelming realities unfolding around us, it left me with a deep sense of despair about the world we're leaving to our kids, the world that my two daughters would be growing up in, as well as a real sense of outrage that, how could we possibly be doing this? And right around the time that I was experiencing those very sort of maternal emotions, I came across the work of another member of this panel, in fact, and that was Marshall Gans. And it was particularly his work organizing with the Obama campaign in 2008. And there was something about the organizing model that was just talked about in this particular article I read that made me think there must be an application to moms and climate change, that there must be a way to bring other mothers together with me who shared the same concerns, shared the same vision for the kind of world we wanted to create for our children. And so I literally called Marshall up and said, would you please meet with me? And he said, yes, thank goodness. And that was where the idea of starting Mothers Out Front came from. 7.5 years after the founding of the organization, we are now a nationwide movement organizing with mothers, teams of mothers in 5 states across the country. And we continue to grow, and that is very much thanks to the inspiration of Marshall Ganz.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. Thank you. Next, let me turn to James Coleman. James Coleman is a senior at the college and a newly elected member of the South San Francisco City Council. Same question, James. Your path to your work, and especially your work on climate, and as I said, go as far back as you want, how your life and your heart moved in this direction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Terry. So my interest in the environmental movement really started back when I was in high school. And this really wasn't too long ago. It was in 2015 when I first became aware of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in North Dakota. And I saw that there was an oil pipeline that was initially meant to be routed through a white suburban neighborhood, received pushback from that community, and instead it was routed through native reservation land. And this pipeline was met with many protests by native peoples, and the government responded by brutalizing them with rubber bullets and water hoses in freezing weather. And me being so young and looking at the United States as, the most wealthy nation in the world, it really surprised me how so many people were fighting for just their right to clean water. And it wasn't just in North Dakota. We see many cities in the United States having this problem. In Crystal Springs, Texas, or in Flint, Michigan, that our basic human needs of clean water and clean air are being infringed upon by these large fossil fuel companies, and that there really needs to be a shift in priorities for our government and our economic system. And this is what really led me to become involved with the Alliance for Climate Education in the Bay Area here. And I was involved in various speaking events. We planned protests, and we also attended other protests in the area. And then after graduating, I went to Harvard College, and I became involved with the Harvard Undergraduates for Environmental Justice and Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard. And really in the fight for economic justice is what's at the root of how I see we need to address climate change. Because climate change and its various issues affect different populations disproportionately. It is usually the people of color and the people who are of a lower socioeconomic status that can't afford to, let's say, move their home because of raising sea levels, or cannot afford air purifiers when the air in California is polluted because of intensified wildfires. It's these issues that affect different populations disproportionately, and made me want to enact change so that no community was left behind when we as a society decide to deal with climate change. And that eventually is what really led me to want to run for city council, because I believe that many of these marginalized communities need a seat at the table that will be advocating for the issues that affect them the most.
Okay, thank you, James. Next, Claire Broome. Claire's class of 70, and since her retirement from the CDC and a role as Assistant Surgeon General, has chosen to be active on climate issues. Claire, your path, your inspiration.
Thanks so much, Terry. And it's something that is really wonderful to share with the audience today, because fortunately, many of us will have second stages. So I spent 28 years working at the Centers for Disease Control and had a wonderful career working on technical issues about how to prevent meningitis and pneumonia around the world. And then I got involved in senior leadership for the agency and learned a little bit about how the government and bureaucracies work, which was educational. And then I retired from the federal service and moved from Atlanta back to California, where I grew up. And I always told my trainees in epidemiology that the most important thing was to frame the question you were trying to answer. And in addition to that, I encouraged them to pick big questions. And when I got back to California, I had the luxury of working on whatever I wanted. And I looked around, and the biggest question was clearly, what are we going to do about the climate crisis? This was in 2006, and I've spent the subsequent 14 years on a journey to answer that question. And first of all, it's not an individual question, and that's one of the reasons I'm on this panel. We have to do it with others. It absolutely requires collaboration. This is not about your individual actions. They're important, but with the urgency of action, we need to mobilize people to act on all levels: governmental, private, entrepreneurial, and we need to do it fast. So, but I also think people have different gifts and different ways they can contribute. So I explored various things I could do. And the two things I will draw on today were, I felt like I wanted to promote renewable energy. It's great. I love it that people, James and so many other people, are protesting and trying to stop further fossil fuel investment and further fossil fuel projects, like we're in a hole, stop digging. But I was more comfortable saying, okay, this is going to work better if we have solutions for people. And so in California, we had some great policies, targets for decreasing greenhouse gases. But it became clear that those needed to get turned into specific activities at the California Public Utility Commission, which of course I'd never heard about before. And so I've gotten involved with the Sierra Club, with 350 Bay Area, in advocating for renewable energy policies at the California Public Utility Commission. I actually sort of masquerade as a regulatory lawyer and file party briefs, which I probably shouldn't admit on a public venue. And it's been a wonderful collaboration. So I've had this brain trust from the Sierra Club. I've had wonderful mentoring and coaching. And we've also mobilized Sierra Club members throughout the state to put pressure when there's particular issues that come up. And then the other major effort, which is even more geared to mobilization, is we've been working to try to address air quality destruction by the refineries in the Bay Area. So there's a wonderful coalition of indigenous people, the Sunflower Alliance, refinery experts, the Sierra Club, the neighborhood communities, who have been, I think, really strategic in figuring out how to push the board of the local air district to implement meaningful controls on refinery emissions. So I'll stop at that point. I wouldn't, we've had victories, but this is ongoing. So I'm really looking forward to the panel and the also dialogue with the incredible resources of the college, because it is an all hands on deck and we need to figure out how to use everybody's gifts.
Very good. Thank you, Claire. Finally, Marshall Gans. class of 1964, who after a career in community organizing returned to Harvard and is now a lecturer at the Kennedy School. Marshall, your story, your path.
Okay, thanks, Terrence. Sound working? Yeah. I wonder if I could ask folks to turn their screens back on. It's much more helpful to be talking to people than black rectangles. I think it might be also more interesting for those who are watching besides, oh, there's James came back. Hi, James. And then I guess there's behind the scenes people. You might as well join us. HAA support, Heather, Mike Mitchell, Rakesh. Ooh, I don't know. Maybe Rakesh is doing some other work. I don't know. But
I don't know if I can start the video, but I'm listening.
all right. Cool. No. Yeah. No. I believe. Yes. Anyway. No. Thanks for the chance to to have this conversation. I came to climate work really pretty indirectly because I came first to organizing, and that was about justice, equality. Because when I was a junior here, I got involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Mississippi Summer Project, and that's what got me into organizing in that context. And what I learned about what I learned from that whole experience was that that power without love, it can never be just, but that love without power can never achieve justice. And that unless that power is rooted broadly and not narrowly, it winds up serving those who hold it. And so the connection between that and democracy and the kind of organizing I was involved in, I stay with that. I mean, I think the question of how people are able to, in fact, influence their circumstances. I think how they're able to use their government as a means of trying to equalize and balance power that's privately held really matters. Because I went from that to the farm workers in California for 16 years, where, again, I essentially learned similar lessons. With the farm workers, it was also, we began to get into the question of pesticides. Because it was having a very direct effect on our people. McFarland, California was one of the cancer spots around, and that was sort of a way in, but I didn't really get active or that engaged until I left the farm workers in '81 and was doing a lot of different things, electoral work and issue work in California. And it was really a couple of things. One was Carl Pope had been a friend for some time. And the Sierra Club at that point in California was trying to shift to become more organizing oriented, more advocacy oriented, and making its move from being more conservation oriented to much more of the other. And Carl, we knew through organizing, and asked me to do some workshops there on organizing then. And the second thing was Big Green. Big Green was an initiative in California in 1990. That was way ahead of its time. But we worked with the PERGs and we worked with others on that initiative. And it was great. It was a great statewide campaign. A lot of people we lost. And it was a lesson about what we were up against. And the fact that this wasn't just a matter of cultural preferences, it was a matter of economic and political power. And that unless we could deal with that, we weren't going to be able to deal with these problems that affect all of us, because the interest that some of us have in them can stop our interest as a whole from being addressed. And when I came back to school here, actually class of Terrence is 64-92, because I'm actually, that's when I finally finished, 92. And then, did a master's here and a PhD here, which is when I met Rakesh. I wasn't that engaged really until, well, life is funny. We were asked to do a project with the Sierra Club again. This was in 2003. They were trying to figure out how to make their local groups work more effectively. And so we wound up putting together what turned into about a 4-year project with the Sierra Club, first on diagnosing the weakness of the local groups and how they could be improved upon. and then secondly, coming up with a way to improve upon them. And that work with Sierra Club there on how to make them work better, which was done with Ruth Wagaman, who is a student of Richard Hackman's here, was very productive. And in fact, the work we did there turned out to be the basis for the Camp Obamas that we organized in 2007 and 8. Came right out of that work, trying to figure out how to build local power, and then that could become state power and national power in that way. But then it was, okay, that was fine, we're doing Obama, and then along comes Power Shift, which was young people, many of whom had been involved in the campaign. And we began doing these large trainings around Power Shift work. And then that's when Kelsey walked in the door. And with Kelsey and also with Rebecca Henderson, we began doing quite a bit of work trying to reawaken the need for broad-based, constituency-based organizing and power behind this, because the movement had, a lot of the orientation had become so elitist and so, the discourse so disconnected from people's daily lives that it was like, I don't know, it wasn't building at the ground what it needed to build. Of course, young people were a constituency because they're going to be on the planet for a while. And I mean, it makes a whole lot of sense. And of course, young people have always, been a major force in every social movement that's ever changed this country. It certainly is the case in my case, and the case of my generation. I think it is again. And then, so that was, and then with Kelsey, it was like, oh, another way to make it real. This was about moms. In other words, the humanizing of the whole challenge seemed really critical if we were to build a power base broad enough and deep enough to actually deal with it. And so, since then, certainly supported Kelsey's work with Mothers Out Front, and any opportunity we have to support, climate change organizing. So that's kind of how I came to it. So I really came to it through questions of justice, questions of democracy, questions of what happens when the interest of the whole is compromised by the power of the few. That's a big problem in a lot of areas, not only this one. I have to think that the denial of climate change is that the sources of denial of climate change are not just the fossil fuel industry, which they have been, but also the ideological resistance to government, that government is bad. Because unless we can use democratic government to act in the interest of the whole, then we're kind of screwed. And we think we've seen an example of that with the virus. And so that's kind of how I come to it. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that, recently I've been doing a lot more work with Sunrise. I think Sunrise is one of the most promising things happening. And a number of my students are involved in that. So I think maybe I'll just stop there, but to say New York State today did a very significant thing. New York State decided to divest from fossil fuels. And I guess my question is, if New York State can do it, why Harvard can't? And, you do what you can. Claire, I so connect with what you're doing, because these things are not all or nothing. There's what you do at the base, there's what you do in the middle, and that's how you build the power to get to the top. I mean, that's kind of how so they all integrate. We talk about the difference between power with, which is collaborative power, you build with other people, and the necessity for that to be able to wield some power over those who exercise power in their interest to the exclusion of the interests of all of us. So that's kind of, I think, where we are right now. And I guess the last thing, the virus taught us what urgency feels like. And this is urgent, and we have to make it urgent.
Very good. Thank you, Marshall. So the kind of the running theme in the title and the description and everything about this is kind of this relationship between protests on the outside, working on the outside, and then mobilization of stakeholders on the inside. And we sort of asked, is that the yin and yang of necessary change? So let me ask each of you maybe in a different way how you see those two. Kelsey, as you said, your father, Tim Wirth, was one of the leaders of climate awareness and response in the Senate. So you've seen the inside approach, as you said, and Mothers Out Front, you take an outside approach, collaborative, but outside. Can you talk about how you see those two working together?
Well, I think that our elected officials have always responded to organized constituencies coming and pushing for bold action. That it is in fact broad-based organized constituencies that make bold decision-making on the part of our elected officials possible. So we provide the political cover, so to speak. We inspire courage among our elected officials. And it's pretty clear that in the absence of that, we do not see bold action. So if you look at, around the time I met Marshall, that was when cap and trade legislation and Congress had just failed. Now, God, that feels like an eon ago. I think that was 2011.
Yeah.
And the Democrats, who are the pro-action on climate change party, ideologically, I'm afraid that's unfortunately where we are right now as a country. So the Democrats had the White House and both houses of Congress and failed to achieve a not terribly bold, frankly, piece of legislation. And the post-mortem on that was, complicated and multifold, obviously, but one of the major conclusions was that we simply did not have an engaged public pushing for action. Part of it was that it was a technical solution that simply, didn't resonate with people. There was nobody really trying to translate this legislation in ways that touch people's lives. And I think that's one of the biggest missing pieces. You can't push for technical policy solutions that people don't understand, that they don't see how those particular solutions are going to make their lives better. And it's one of the jobs of outside constituencies pushing for this changes. It's one of the jobs of constituencies, groups like Mothers Out Front, to take these enormous, overwhelming problems, to take these sort of technical solutions and help to translate them and going that way, make sure that we're breaking down these big problems into manageable bite-sized pieces that people can understand and wrap their arms around, and going the other way, making sure that the policy solutions being created, and perhaps this is even more important, are being informed by communities of real people whose lives are going to be affected by them. And that gets into all kinds of questions around equity and justice. And so often the communities that are consistently left out of these conversations are the communities that are being most impacted. And so I think there's just no doubt that an organized constituencies across the country have a vital role to play in keeping our politicians honest, pushing for bold action, pushing for solutions that are about improving people's lives, and continuing to hold those politicians' feet to the fire going forward. I think in the absence of that, we know what happens, which is simply nothing.
Yeah. James, just months ago, you were an outsider. You were working on the campaign at Harvard to divest from fossil fuels. You were working on things in Cambridge, dealing with the homeless community, with the essential workers at Harvard and so on. And now you sit on the city council of your hometown. How do you view organizing in protest versus organizing for elections? Because suddenly to get elected, you had to shift and master that sort of organizing. How do you see those two paths, and how do you think others see them?
Yeah, I believe that for a movement to be successful, you need a really powerful inside strategy and a really powerful outside strategy. And they're both not mutually exclusive. They have to work intimately together. Um, and, FDR, when he was meeting with a group of activists one day, he said, "I agree with you, you've convinced me, but go out and make me do it." And that's because he understood that you need a sense of urgency and need among the general masses in order to push for bold legislation and change. FDR was, one voice in his administration. I, as a city council member, am only one voice in a group of 5, and we don't just need protests and energy to change the minds of the others, but also to push people like myself to act boldly and to push for my own colleagues to vote a certain way. And so I believe that there is, a very intimate interplay between people in power as well as those on the streets. Because those in the streets, protests have the power to really shift the dialogue and make them possible seem possible. And protest is a way to ask questions that otherwise wouldn't be asked and to start discussions that otherwise wouldn't be discussed. And that this is very valuable in providing the vision and the perspective that people in power need. And then it is the jobs of the people in power to figure out ways in which to achieve that vision that we all want.
Let me ask you one quick question, which is that, did you have any of your friends in your protest alliances, how did they react when you said, "I'm running for city council"? Anyone say, "Wait a minute, you're going over to the other side"? Anyone?
I think a lot of people have different perspectives on this. Some, unfortunately, I believe, are disillusioned to the political process, and they don't have too much faith in those in power, because you might see someone get elected and then they act more moderately. But I believe that in order for someone who ran on very bold issues to enact those bold issues and make them into reality, you need the support, the continued support of those in the community, in the activist community. Because when you have that backing behind you, that is what pushes the others in positions of power to follow.
Can I just add to?
Yeah, Marshall.
Yeah, I really appreciate your analysis, James. I think it's spot on. And your example, because Dan Schlossman at Johns Hopkins wrote a very good book called "When Movements Anchor Parties," and it's a reprise of American history and where major social change happens that involves political action. And what he shows is that it's always been this dance between movements and parties, and I think it's an artificial separation to say, well, this is inside, that's outside. I think the question is, where's the power? And there are situations and related to that is the question is, which is the dog and which is the tail? In other words, is it the inside wagging the outside, or is the outside wagging the inside? Makes a huge difference, because it always comes back to the power question. When I was in the farm workers, we were always actively involved in politics, and certainly in getting Jerry Brown involved, played a major role in our work. It's a continuum, I think. And there are different roles to play, but it's always coming back to this question: how do we mobilize the power we need in the interest of the whole, or as close to the whole as we can get? That you keep coming back to that same. I guess one of our biggest challenges in this country is that our system has become so undemocratic. Literally, the Electoral College, the Senate itself, and so there's sort of it's in a way, at least at the federal level, it's becoming less representative every year, because the population growth is in the cities, it's with young people, it's very diverse. But take a look at the Senate, and it's not that, and it's quite the opposite. And so we have problems making the democracy work the way it's supposed to work, which means it often takes even more outside effort, even more social movement organizing. That would be a different picture if we really had the kind of representation of one voice, one vote, if that were a reality, which it isn't. That would make things so much more accessible in any event. But it just, for me, it just underscores the importance of this approach. It's just this last thing. I mean, looking at power, and this with respect to both what Claire and James have been talking about, I teach often from the example of the Montgomery bus boycott, because that started the modern civil rights movement. And you could look at that problem as one of institutionalized racism. You could look at that problem as one of segregation. But it really got real when it was a problem of having to go to work on the bus every day, sit in the back, give up your seat to a white person if they asked for it twice a day, and imagining what a desegregated bus would look like. And now they tried to tackle that with a lawsuit first, but it was when Rosa Parks got arrested, they said, well, wait a second, we got to support Rosa Parks, and it turned into a boycott. As a result, they discovered the power they had as a community. And that's really what sparked the civil rights movement, was that the way you go about dealing with these things that have to be real in people's lives, real at the next level, legislative level, real at the institutional level. Sometimes you have to make it so real that then you can build the base that you need in order to build the power that you need. And I think that just goes back to the beginning we were talking about. This has to be real to people and urgent.
Yeah. One quick note, you were dealing, you spoke, Marshall, about the federal level and the undemocratic nature of the Senate, the Electoral College, and so on. And as we've seen on the state levels through gerrymandering, as I think you said when I talked to you earlier, you know, cows in Wyoming have much more voice than people in California, you know, but in every state, the rural seems to have you know, an overabundance of power compared to the urban. Claire, you worked within government, not elected, worked within government, and you worked on epidemiology, a word that probably an awful lot of people have only learned in the last 9 months. You know, any lessons that you, as you've been watching our response to the pandemic, or the response of, you know, the roles you used to fill, lessons for the climate movement?
So thanks for that question. And I'd sort of like to combine answering that question with the earlier one, because I completely agree with what's been said. But as an epidemiologist, I tend to get quantitative and concrete. And so I sort of had 3 responses to the question of inside versus outside in terms of making that work. And one is what I said earlier, what's the question? But for mobilizations, it comes down to what's the ask, having a strategic ask. And you could tie that to what Marshall was talking about with the boycott. Some of it is something people can understand, but also framing it in a way that you can't get buffaloed by technical staff and paid lobbyists who say, oh, that's too expensive, that's not feasible. And, you know, a mass mobilization doesn't necessarily have the resources to counter that. But if the ask is intelligible and well framed, and that's what we found with the refinery coalition, when instead of fighting each regulation, we said to the board, who were elected officials, cap emissions. Just have a, you know, we don't care how they do it, just enforce a cap. And I thought that was so smart. We could talk about what happened next, but then the second issue is, and this is very much from my epidemiologic background, what gets measured gets done. And I think we tend to see a lot of these mobilizations as get the good guys elected, but it can't stop there. You have to hold them accountable. And I think coming up, having mobilizations recognize that. And, you know, Marshall, I love hearing your involvement with the Sierra Club, because I am such a fan of how the Sierra Club works and incorporates volunteer energy and action, but also has the resources to have the staff and the lawyers to use all of that energy to get action. And one of the things they do in California is they have a legislative scorecard, and they pick a selected number of key bills, and you can find out exactly how your state senator or your state assembly person voted. And they publicize it very well. They've got a really good communication structure. So accountability and picking what you're going to measure, I think, is really important. Then the final thing is, and I think this was my main takeaway from years of working within the bureaucracy, it's very easy to focus on the negative, why this isn't going to happen. And I mean, I could go on for hours about the difficulties and how, you know, the Public Utility Commission is captured by the utilities and does not work for the public. But I ended up looking at it personally, and what I tried to communicate to my trainees as, okay, this is part of problem solving. Human beings are intrinsically problem solving animals, and they both as individuals and as groups. And so, okay, let's deal with the realities of, you know, for the pandemic, the fact that emergency communication is blocked and the CDC is prevented from getting public health messages out. This is a catastrophe for the country. What are we going to do about that? And, you know, it's not trivial. It's not the way you choose to do it. But I think it's impressive. The states and local governments stepped up, other institutions stepped up. I can tell you the people who got out there with the news media, which stepped up to, you know, get the messages out. There were a lot of countervailing forces. So, but the point for climate is see it as a problem to be solved, not as they have all the money, they have all the K Street lobbyists, let's just give up.
No, I think that Walter Brueggemann, a Protestant theologian, wrote a book called Prophetic Imagination, in which he argues that prophetic, or what he called transformational vision, occurs at the intersection of two things. One is criticality. It's a clear view of the world's pain, of its hurt, of its need, coupled with hope, a sense of its promise and possibilities. And that one without the other either goes to despair or irrelevance, but it's the interaction of the two that moves you forward. And that really creates the energy for change. But hope and optimism are two different things. I mean, hope is realistic, optimism may not be. The best definition of hope I've found is, I seem to be in, I don't know, theological sources, Maimonides says, hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. In other words, it's always probable Goliath will win, but sometimes David does. It was improbable we'd elect a Black man president of this country, but we did. It's that sense of possibility, of could be, not will be, but could be, that we have in our own lives, that we have in our own experiences that have to be part of this, Claire. And so I couldn't agree more. It's not just gloom and doom, it has to be possibility, but the possibility has to be real. I mean, it has to be a kind of possibility that we could actually imagine. And not fantasy. And so, you know, that's kind of, for me, that's the sweet spot, is there, because they both have to be there. People just don't organize around grievances, not if they don't think there's some possibility of doing something about it. And so that's, again, where your work, I think, is so important, because it offers a sense of possibility of moving forward. Like the bus boycott in Montgomery, didn't end institutionalized racism in America, God knows. But it was a way to begin moving forward and to build the power. We just have a very urgent situation right now. And I guess the question is how to make that urgency real enough that we work on all these levels.
I know that I'm going to turn to questions from the audience in a few moments. And so I want to make sure that I get this one in. First of all, I wanted to say, you had quoted Paul Tillich before, and I found another Tillich quote, "The first duty of love is to listen." And I thought that was so central to everything we're talking about, that to make it real for people, we've got to be able to listen. But my question is to all of you, is if we're saying, how do we change the way climate change feels to people? How do we translate the feeling to organized power? What are some of the things that give each of you hope? To go back to the virtue you just mentioned, Marshall, what gives you hope, James?
I think it really is, in line with what Marshall said, the vision and the hope that we have for the future. When we ran our campaign for city council, one of our slogans was "A better South City is possible." We can guarantee a high quality early childhood education for every family. We can envision a city where we have clean air and clean water, where we can address the climate crisis in a way that does not leave any person or any community behind. A Green New Deal that can provide highly paid construction jobs and renewable energy jobs for everyone in our city. It really is having that vision, a lot of that provided by the people who are organizing these protests, because they see that a better future is possible, and it is contagious. When you have that vision and you go out in the streets and you're putting yourself out there and telling people, this is possible, this is why I'm out here, and this is why I'm fighting for change, then other people will join you and they will believe in your vision of change.
Very good. Kelsey, reasons for hope.
I think first and foremost for me, my hope comes from all the mothers and other people who care about our children, who are part of Mothers Out Front, who I get to interact with and see the work that they're doing day in and out with each other on teams to stop proposed, pipelines, to pass municipal bills that require new construction to be built without gas hookups, to pass, to ensure that the San Diego County Air Quality Control District hires full-time environmental justice staff. I mean, the stories that I hear all the time from the moms themselves are so incredibly inspiring, not just the successes that they're having, which are real and concrete, but the extent to which they have been transformed through the work that they're doing, feeling a sense of agency for the first time ever in the face of this overwhelming problem, becoming extraordinary advocates and leaders for change. It's the most heartening. It's the most heartening thing to witness, and to see that there is actually potential to be engaging people in their communities in every town and city and every state across this country. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind there's an appetite there. It's just a matter of figuring out how to get those people engaged. But whether it's organizing moms or young people, and you look at, as Marshall said, the Sunrise Movement, and the Greta Thunbergs and the others out there who are engaging young people. Just this morning, I was talking to a group of nurses and physicians in California that's organizing, that is bringing people together and as part of something called Climate Health Now. I had another conversation just this morning with a group of moms in the UK that have formed something called Moms Climate Action Network and wanted to talk about how Mothers Out Front got started. I mean, we're seeing more and more of a recognition of the need for the kind of broad public engagement and constituency building and organizing that we're talking about today. We're just seeing it across all different sectors of our society, different demographic groups, people understanding the interconnectedness between economic justice, racial justice, and climate justice. We can't have climate justice without economic and racial justice. People are increasingly recognizing that. And as we increasingly recognizing it, what used to be siloed movements are coming together and creating goals together and creating legislative visions like the Green New Deal. We've never seen anything like that before. We finally have a president, instead of running away from climate, is embracing it. I mean, and all of this is happening because of the growth of these organized constituencies that are pushing for change. So I start with the moms and then I move beyond that, and you just look at the number of people who are getting involved now and the limitless potential out there.
Thank you, thank you. Claire, reasons for hope.
So I would concur with what Kelsey was saying about the people that I work with. And when I was at CDC, it was such an honor and a pleasure to work with incredibly skilled, knowledgeable scientific experts, laboratory experts. But I'm equally in awe of the people that I've met working on climate issues, from the community organizers in Richmond to the gearheads, the electrical engineers who have very kindly and graciously educated me about this, to regulatory lawyers. I never thought I would say that, you know, some of my best friends are regulatory lawyers. And also the power of groups. So the people, God love them, who work with the legislature. That's not my particular charism, but I love it that there's wonderful people with Sierra Club and 350 Bay Area who are completely enmeshed in the state legislative process. But the second area which gives me hope, I think we do need successes, and I will hold up technology. And I'm not saying technology is going to save us, absolutely not. But what it has enabled is phenomenal. And I'm talking about the kind of communication networks. I'm talking about Zoom. I'm talking about the ability to have a brain trust on a weekly conference call throughout California, which can bring people together on what's happening in the legislature, what's happening in the regulatory bodies. And then I think, obviously, the technology for renewable energy. What is feasible and economic now is totally different than what was possible 10 years ago. And we have to, you know, I totally subscribe to the mobilization and push it and make it happen. But it's a whole lot easier if it actually saves you money. So, you know, those are my two main reasons, and both of which I think the mobilization, we have the people. We may not always have the money, but I would never underestimate what the people and what Kelsey working and spreading the message can do.
Very good. Marshall, hope?
Yeah, well, I'd say James, I'd say Kelsey, I'd say Claire. I'd say that, you know, that this is happening. Really, that's really where it is, I think. You know, young people come of age with a critical eye, but almost of necessity, hopeful hearts. It's one reason that young people have been such an important part in any major social change movement. because of course it's their future. They also have the energy. They're also maybe a little more courageous than some of us, because it takes courage to push, push the envelope open here and push the deal. And Kelsey's work, Claire's work. I mean, look at the cross-generational dimension we have here. So, I mean, that's where I get it. It's not like someday something's going to descend and save us. It's like, it's the work we do and who we are and the commitments we make, I think, is our source of strength. And for me, it's certainly a source of hope.
Thank you. I apologize. There's some gardening going on outside my window. If you hear a blower, it's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to audience questions now. I'm going to pair two of them together. One of them was asking, does successful activism require a scary boogie monster? Whether it's climate change, COVID, or the fossil fuel industry. Another asks, what's the role? Is it a plus or a minus, helpful, or does it have liabilities of naming and calling out the opposition and stating their most egregious acts and so on, and their funding and so on? So does it call for a boogeyman, and does it help to point out the boogeyman and label the boogeyman? Anyone?
Well, I just very quickly, I mean, I think it's the boogeymen, or however we want to call it, are responsible for a lot of the problems. In other words, you don't have to call them, you don't have to create them, they're there. And so then the question is, do they get held responsible? Do they get held accountable? And so I'm not talking about like calling names or that kind of, no. I mean, movements are tricky. They have an expressive dimension, which is I'm going to make my voice heard because it hasn't been heard, but also strategic dimension, which is in this way, at this time, in this place, in order to bring this outcome. And those things are often sometimes in tension within a movement. And it's just the nature of the thing. But yeah, just calling names doesn't do anything, but holding those responsible accountable is fundamental. Because it's always like, well, it's not me, it's the system. Well, yeah, except you decide how to spend certain millions of dollars every year, so it is you. I mean, it's all of us, but some of us, hold responsibility for, I think, the fact that we're not moving faster. So yeah, but it's not like calling names, it's just identifying where the responsibility lies and where you can focus your effort to get some change.
Yeah, I would just follow up and just say and agree entirely with, surprise, with what Marshall just said. Every time we're developing a campaign, the campaign needs a target or targets, but you need to, I mean, that's for strategic reason. You need to know if you're bringing power to bear to change something, you're not simply changing a system, you're changing the hearts and minds of the people who can change the system. Systems don't change on their own. I mean, they're made up of people. So I think that's really essential. It doesn't mean it has to be an entirely or even remotely antagonistic process. A target is not an enemy necessarily. Sometimes they are, but a target can simply be a strategic focus of a campaign, because that's the decision maker with the power of making the changes necessary to see the change you want to see.
Yeah, what I hear there is a target is a target. It might be what you want to achieve. It might be what you want to stop.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, time for one more share from each of you. Basically, I call this kind of a closing comment. You've got an audience out there that was interested in these questions. What's kind of each of your kind of, word to them as we end this? Claire.
Well, thanks to everybody, and I hope the audience has found this as inspiring as I have. And so my closing comment is, we need everybody to get involved, and it's an enormously constructive, rewarding involvement. I have felt energized and enjoyed with some frustration, the efforts that I've been involved with. And there's so many local, state, federal, private efforts where you can make a difference. So I look forward to people exploring and finding something that fits their particular inspiration, motivation, and come on in.
Okay. Oh, let me just say, Claire, you answered a piece of that I forgot to put in, which is, can we tell people things they can do, actions they can take? And you basically said, get involved with local organizations. Who wants to go next? Your closing statement, what can people do? Kelsey.
I'm happy to follow up on what Claire said, to largely agree with what she did say, which is really every person has a role to play in addressing the climate crisis. And the role that you play in particular depends on, you know, who you are, what institutions you're associated with, what what institutions you might be leading. No matter where you are, you have an opportunity to make a difference. And I would say, needless to say, please, we welcome you to join Mothers Out Front. If that's of interest, you don't need to be a mom. We are mom-led. We are certainly not exclusively moms. And we need to create a broad-based movement. And so welcome everybody. And we also work very well with other organizations, of which there are many to choose from. I would also say, when thinking about the institutions that you're part of, every one of us is part of the Harvard Alumni Network. And back to some of Marshall's opening comments, today we saw one of the largest pension funds in the world announce it's divesting from fossil fuels. Every one of us has a role to play in encouraging this institution to divest from fossil fuels, because there's absolutely no reason to not be doing it. And this institution has a fundamental leadership role it can play at the global level that other institutions will follow.
Thank you. James?
I think, don't be afraid to put yourself out there and get involved in these organizations, because there are a multitude of ways that you can help. Activism is not just going out and protesting. There's also many hours and hours of planning and coalition building that happens behind the scenes that we don't see. And legal advice, expertise in building websites. All these skills can be very resourceful to these organizations, and several of them have been named today: Sunrise Movement, Sierra Club. There's a Fossil Fuel Divest Harvard alumni group. All these could really use your help. And this is a opportunity for Harvard and other leading institutions to lead in fighting the climate crisis. And I would be honored if you could join all of us, whether it be Mothers Out Front, Divest Harvard, in really pushing our institution to be a leader.
And I suppose you might also encourage folks to run for office.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Marshall, last word. What can people do?
I think I agree with what was just said. I mean, I think that's where it is. I think it's making a choice. It's stepping up and getting that you cannot do this alone. In other words, you have to find with whom to work. Just clicking on your internet does not do it. It's finding other people with whom to work, because that's really where it's where the moral energy comes from. It's where the creativity comes from, and ultimately it's where the power comes from. So yes, that's it.
Very good. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thanks to all the sponsors and producers. Thanks to you, the panelists. And it was actually fun to see all of your faces at the same time. I will agree, Marshall. And thank you to all who tuned in, and share this, folks, because it will be on YouTube forever. The links will be up there. share this experience if it was beneficial to you, and let's bring more and more people into this conversation. Thank you. And our next session of this will be January 13th. And the question will be, are we going to get it done? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone.